Paolo Garretto was born one of 4 children in Naples in 1903 to a Sicilian father who worked as an academic and historian, and a Swiss mother who I can tell you nothing about. In 1918 the family relocated to Rome, and a couple of years later Paolo embarked on the study of architecture at the university. But he increasingly gravitated towards illustration and the art of the burgeoning futurist movement. And like many in Italy at that time, he also became an enthusiastic supporter of Benito Mussolini's ascendant fascist political movement. And when the party came to power in 1922, not only was Garretto selected to be one of Mussolini's personal honour guard, but he also designed what became the official uniform of the paramilitary wing, known more commonly as the black shirts. But within a couple of years he became increasingly disillusioned with the movement and subsequently severed any connection. The earliest examples of verifiably dated work I could find were a couple of radically geometric caricatures from 1926, one of which was of Filippo Marinetti, the founder of Futurism. And a year later he created this dynamic futurist influence poster for a motor race in Rome. But it was also in that year that he travelled to London in search of work outside Italy, and although not welcomed by most publishers, he did have some caricatures, including this image of Winston Churchill, published in the Graphic magazine. It was also in 1927 that he married Ariane Muratori, with whom he produced a son Ezio, and they set up their home in Paris. From there, Garretto became increasingly involved with the design of posters for French clients, all of which demonstrated his facility for the creation of geometrically structured imagery, which had no time at all for conventional representation. And although resident in Paris, it was also at this time that he established a long-running relationship with La Rivista Illustrata del Popolo d'Italia, the magazine belonging to the newspaper which had been established by Benito Mussolini in 1914. And other than this particularly striking poster for a hat manufacturer, it seems most of his energy was reserved at this time for his ongoing commitment to La Rivista. Among others, he did create this striking image lionising the black shirts, but most of what he was now creating for the covers and pages of La Rivista didn't reveal any similar pro-Mussolini agenda, and were simply exercises in futurist aesthetics. But crucially for his career, it was at the beginning of the 1930s that his work appeared for the first time in the USA, on the cover of the prestigious and influential Vanity Fair magazine. At this point, all the covers and page illustrations were geometric caricatures, similar to what he had been producing earlier. And these humorous portraits of celebrities and well-known figures of the period made a significant impression with the sophisticated urban readership of the magazine. And although there were a growing number of others creating similarly modernist illustration at the time, it was Garretto who was arguably pushing hardest at how far caricature could go before turning into pure abstraction. At the same time, he was also commissioned by the recently established business magazine Fortune, and in this context, where the humour of his caricature work would be inappropriate, there was no human element of any kind within the images. Instead, this was a collection of covers which played to his talent for futurist-style scenic image making and composition, and they were undoubtedly successful in their mission. Nevertheless, it was his more humorous work for Vanity Fair which continued to be dominant in his output during the decade. In all his work, Garretto was keen to explore and exploit what can only be described as the application and juxtaposition of mixed media. He frequently used a mechanical airbrush to spray clean tonal and flat geometric shapes with the use of masks, and combined this with all manner of line and colour work created by more traditional means. And he increasingly started to experiment with the inclusion of collage, with cut-out shapes made out of all manner of materials and textiles. Again, this was an aspect of his creative impulse which made his images so distinctive. Within a year or two of having first appeared in Vanity Fair, the images he was now creating had, at least to an extent, moved away from caricatured portraits in favour of more opinionated satirical reflections on the contemporary world, and particularly American and world politics. By this point there were undoubted signs of global turmoil, and this aspect became an increasingly frequent feature in his work, along with other images reflecting on the state of the American economy under President Roosevelt. According to Garretto himself, he was given free rein by the magazine to make his own eloquent visual statements without editorial control, a clear indication of the esteem he was held in at that time. He was by now much less prolific in his production of posters, but the few he did produce continued to demonstrate his formidable graphic prowess. And although he didn't seem to be creating any work for French clients at this time, there were still ongoing caricatures produced for La Rivista back in Italy, even though they were only published in monochrome. But among the colour caricatures he created for Vanity Fair was this particularly striking and upbeat mixed media image of the dancer Josephine Baker. And there were other images produced which were similarly frivolous in tone, although more sinister observations continued to appear fairly regularly too. And although he was being kept more than busy enough with his work for La Rivista and particularly Vanity Fair, he somehow also found the time to create a large volume of cover images for the French men's fashion magazine Adam, an association which began in 1935. The covers Garretto produced for his new client were some considerable distance from the more predictable, stylish but emotionally neutral fashion images the magazine had featured to date. Not only were they far more visually distinctive, but they were also infused with a good-natured and occasionally surreal humour not usually associated with such publications. And this revolution in the visual style of the magazine proved to be immensely popular, to the extent that with just a handful of exceptions, when he was presumably unavailable due to his many other commitments, he illustrated the cover for every month's edition of Adam for the next few years. Although the lack of evidence suggests he had by now stopped working for Vanity Fair, there was no perceptible drop in his productivity, and between 1936 and 1937 there was another significant run of poster designs, created for a wide range of Italian, French and American clients. All of these were graphically well considered, skillfully rendered and memorable, all ideal qualities in advertising. And although it wasn't exclusively the case, the majority of them were travel-themed and not overtly humorous in nature. Additionally, he was still contributing to both La Rivista with this worryingly militaristic cover and yet more monochrome caricature work, as well as the occasional stylish cover for Fortune. But it was the memorable series of images he continued to create for Adam which were undoubtedly his main occupation. These covers all continued to make significant use of his fascination for the incorporation of collage added to his airbrush and traditional painted applications. And although by no means as extreme in their use of geometric construction as his earlier work had been, they were nevertheless still a very long way from representational. And he used his expressive abilities to make gentle fun of the readership of the magazine and their supposed lifestyles and favoured pursuits such as hunting and keeping fit. But in 1939 World War II began, and following the publication of his last Adam cover, he was immediately obliged to get out of France, as Mussolini's Italy was by now allied with Hitler's Germany. So in 1940 he left for New York, where he created his last cover for Fortune, and he also married for the second time. But only a year later the USA joined forces with the Allies and he was forced to return to Italy. This is where it all started to unravel for Garretto, and as there isn't a single piece of work to be found from the years of the war, I'm obliged to fill in the blanks here with other images from a little earlier in his career. On his return to his homeland, he was urged to use his graphic talents to create propaganda vilifying the Allies, but he refused to do so, and as a consequence he and his wife wound up in a Hungarian internment camp before their eventual release as the war ended. In 1946 Garretto returned to New York, but his welcome was far from warm. So he sailed for France, where his presence was at least tolerated, and in 1947 he published Gloglo, the story of a little seal, which he had written and illustrated while incarcerated in Hungary. As far as I can tell, this was his only venture into children's book work, And given the charm and agreeable silliness evident in the work, it seems a particular pity to me at least that he produced no others. Many of the illustrations featured characters set against page white, with minimal background elements, although there was also the occasional more populated double-page spread to maintain the interest of his young readers. Although resident in Paris again, it seems that during the later 1940s most of the illustration work he was producing was for publication in Italy, and the bulk of it appears to have been exclusively in the form of posters, many of which dispensed with his usual predilection for more comedic image making and concentrated more on purely decorative, if suitably modernist image creation, similar to what A.M. Cassandra and others in France were producing at the time. But the humorist in Garretto couldn't be kept down for long, and as the 1950s began, he was responsible for a particularly successful humorous monochrome press ad campaign, featuring famous Italians from history and their totally spurious connection with the product. And at the same time he began a series of full-colour posters for the somewhat unpromising client Valstar men's rainwear. And the whimsical light humour of Garretto's various scenarios made this a particularly popular campaign in Italy, which ran successfully for a couple of years. It was obvious by now in both his monochrome and colour work that the extreme geometric approach he had favoured before the war had softened noticeably and become more mainstream in its appeal. Whether this was a concession to changing times or just his personal inclination, I couldn't say with any authority. But the many posters he produced in the early years of the decade were far more stylistically diverse than his earlier output, and he roamed freely between overt agreeable humour and more straight-faced image creation, with great success for a wide range of clients. By this point all his output was exclusively for Italian clients, even though he continued to live and work in Paris. But unfortunately for Garretto, in the early 1950s, he was presented with a significantly large bill for unpaid taxes, which he disputed but nevertheless decided to take the less problematic option of getting out of Paris fast and relocating to neighbouring Monaco. From his new home he continued to work for Italian clients, and for the next few years appears to have worked exclusively in advertising, with the creation of quite a few more amusing, stylish posters for a range of clients and products, some of which were major international businesses. But in the middle of the decade he also started to create what would become a particularly long-running series of caricatures and humorous scenarios for the Italian magazine Epoca, reflecting on the current political figures and events taking place around the world, and of course in Italy itself. And very quickly he seems to have abandoned his obviously successful stint as a poster designer in favour of exclusively editorial illustration for this magazine. The work he produced for Epoca continues to explore the potential of airbrushed and traditionally painted elements, with the occasional incorporation of collage. And as with his earlier Vanity Fair covers, he expressed his own socio-political views through the humorous scenarios he created. Many, of course, used his talent for caricature of specific figures on the world stage, but most were more generic mockery and simply made fun of the folly of his fellow humans. Although manifestly no longer an international success, he remained very popular in his own country. He carried on creating these images for Epoca for quite a few more years, and was still creatively active in that capacity into old age. The last dated work I found for the magazine was this amusing beach scene from 1986, and following a long and more than usually eventful life and career, Paolo Garretto died in Monte Carlo in 1989 at the age of 86. Despite the almost total destruction of his career during the Second World War, and the enduring stigma of belonging to the losing team, the persistence of Garretto's creative drive and modernistic stylistic approach enabled him to carry on, even if no longer working on an international scale, and you have to admire his determination. Along with a handful of others among his contemporaries, he was largely responsible for the move towards modernism in illustration, derived from the early 20th century radical art movements. And if it had not been for his later unwelcome status in the USA, I think he would now have a much higher profile, more worthy of that contribution.